Okay, so get ready, because today we're going deep into history's dark side.
Yeah, we're going to be looking at 10 individuals whose actions resulted in mass casualties. Like, it's really hard to even comprehend the scale.
Yeah, and before we jump in, I think it's really important to just acknowledge how sensitive this topic is.
Absolutely.
Our focus is on trying to understand the scope of these figures' actions, and definitely not glorifying them in any way, shape, or form.
Right.
Our source material for this deep dive is an AI-generated list. And I know that has, its own complexities.
Yeah, AI is just a tool. And like any tool, it kind of reflects the data it's trained on.
Right.
So we're using this list as a starting point, but it's our job to kind of go beyond the surface and, really delve into the historical context for each individual.
Yeah, for sure. And to be clear, this is not a top 10 list.
Right.
This isn't like a competition of like who's the most evil or anything like that.
No, not at all.
These individuals represent like different eras, motivations, methods, and, numbers alone can't really fully capture the horror of what happened.
Right. And what I think is really fascinating is how this list spans like centuries and different geographies.
Yeah.
So it kind of gives us a glimpse into these recurring patterns of power and ambition and, unfortunately, violence that have shaped human history.
Yeah.
We have figures from ancient times like Genghis Khan all the way to 20th century dictators like Stalin and Mao Zedong.
Okay, so let's start with Genghis Khan.
Okay.
The source material says that he's notorious not just for the battlefield victories, but for the brutal massacres of entire populations who resisted his rule.
Right.
So we're talking about the 13th century here, a time when much of Eurasia was in constant turmoil.
Yeah.
So was Genghis Khan simply a product of his time, or did he take things to like a whole new level?
That's a really great question. And, while warfare was definitely common during Genghis Khan's time,
Right.
his approach was particularly ruthless. He really understood the power of fear, and he used it very strategically.
Huh.
When a city resisted him, he didn't just conquer it.
Right.
He made an example of it. He would slaughter inhabitants and just leave these ruins as a warning to others.
Wow.
This tactic, while incredibly brutal, was very, very effective in consolidating his power.
So it wasn't just about winning battles, it was about breaking the will of his enemies and, discouraging future resistance.
Exactly.
Wow, that's a chilling insight into his mindset.
It is.
Okay, speaking of chilling, let's talk about Vlad the Impaler.
Okay.
His death toll might not be in the millions, like some of these other figures, but his methods were notoriously gruesome.
Oh, yeah.
Impalement, as the name suggests, was his, preferred method of execution.
Right.
But why such a specific, brutal method?
Yeah.
What was the point beyond just inflicting pain?
Well, Vlad ruled Wallachia, which was constantly under threat from the Ottoman Empire. And his use of impalement was more than just sadism, it was psychological warfare. So imagine you're an invading soldier and you see just rows and rows of impaled bodies lining the road.
Oh my gosh.
The sheer terror that sight would evoke is unimaginable.
Yeah.
And Vlad understood that fear could be a weapon, and he used it masterfully.
So it was about creating this spectacle of horror.
Yeah.
This like visual deterrent that went beyond battlefield tactics.
Absolutely.
Wow. It's disturbing how effective that kind of psychological warfare can be.
Yeah, for sure. Vlad's tactics really raise some interesting questions about the relationship between power and fear and propaganda.
Yeah.
It's a theme that we're going to see recurring throughout history, even in modern times.
Yeah.
Though thankfully not always with such gruesome methods.
Okay. So moving on to the 19th century,
Right.
we encounter King Leopold II of Belgium,
Okay.
a figure whose actions in the Congo Free State were driven by a different kind of motivation.
Yeah.
Greed.
Right.
The source describes the Congo as his personal colony,
It was.
a source of immense wealth that he exploited ruthlessly.
Yep. Yeah, what's so disturbing about Leopold's case is the calculated nature of his exploitation.
Right.
He masked his greed behind this veneer of philanthropy.
Wow.
He claimed to be bringing civilization to the Congo.
Oh, gosh.
In reality, he was running this brutal regime of forced labor, extracting rubber and ivory at an unimaginable human cost.
Yeah.
Millions died under his rule, not as casualties of war, but as victims of this systematic and deliberate exploitation.
So while figures like Genghis Khan used brutality as like a tool of conquest,
Right.
Leopold used it as a tool of profit.
Exactly.
It's a reminder that evil doesn't always wear a military uniform, sometimes wears a suit,
Yeah.
and hides behind the facade of economic progress.
Precisely. And Leopold's case highlights how systems of power like colonialism can enable and even incentivize exploitation.
Wow.
He wasn't just a lone villain. He was operating within a larger system that facilitated his greed and shielded him from accountability.
Yeah, that's a sobering thought. And speaking of sobering, we've now reached the 20th century, which sadly offers a plethora of figures for our list.
It does.
Let's start with one of the most infamous dictators in history, Adolf Hitler.
Okay.
So Hitler's actions, fueled by this toxic ideology, rooted in racial hatred and nationalism, led to the Holocaust.
Right.
The systematic genocide of 6 million Jews, along with millions of others, deemed undesirable by the Nazi regime. The scale of the Holocaust is difficult to even grasp.
It is.
The source points out that Hitler also initiated World War II, a conflict that resulted in tens of millions of deaths worldwide.
Right.
So his impact extends far beyond even the horrors of the Holocaust itself.
Oh, absolutely. Hitler's rise to power was facilitated by this really complex interplay of factors. Germany's defeat in World War I,
Yeah,
the subsequent economic depression, and the rise of nationalist sentiment across Europe.
right.
And he exploited these conditions brilliantly. He used propaganda and scapegoating to channel public anger and fear into support for his hateful ideology.
It's a stark reminder that charismatic leaders can be incredibly dangerous, especially when they exploit existing societal anxieties and divisions to gain power.
For sure.
And unfortunately, that's a pattern we're going to see repeated as we continue our deep dive.
Yeah, we will.
So stay tuned for part 2, where we'll explore the lives and legacies of other figures on the AI's list of history's most notorious individuals.
Welcome back to our exploration of history's dark side. As we delve deeper into these figures, it's important to remember that our purpose is not to sensationalize their actions, but to understand their impact and the factors that allowed them to rise to such horrifying prominence.
Right, exactly. We're examining this dark underbelly of power, the ways in which ambition, ideology, and circumstance can converge to create individuals who are capable of unimaginable cruelty.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, we left off discussing Adolf Hitler. It's hard to imagine a figure who casts a longer shadow over the 20th century.
Yeah, Hitler's legacy is just this chilling reminder of the dangers of unchecked nationalism and racial hatred. The Holocaust stands as a stark warning against the dehumanization of entire groups of people based on prejudice and unfounded fears.
Right.
But as we move forward in our exploration, it's important to note that Hitler wasn't alone in perpetrating atrocities on a massive scale during the 20th century.
Right. Next on the AI's list is Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union for over 3 decades.
Right.
He's often compared to Hitler in terms of the sheer number of deaths attributed to his regime.
Right.
But how did Stalin's rise to power and his methods differ from Hitler's?
Well, while both men were dictators who ruled through fear and repression, their paths to power and the specifics of their ideologies were quite different.
Okay.
Hitler rose to power through a combination of political maneuvering propaganda and the exploitation of economic anxieties.
Right.
Stalin, on the other hand, consolidated his power within the existing structure of the Communist Party.
Okay.
He eliminated rivals and consolidated his control through a system of purges and forced disappearances.
So both men were masters of manipulation, but they played different games, so to speak.
Hitler was the showman, the orator who captivated the masses.
Right.
Stalin was more the calculating strategist operating behind the scenes to eliminate opposition and secure his grip on power.
Precisely. And their ideological motivations also differed significantly.
Okay.
Hitler was driven by a racial ideology that saw the Aryan race as superior and sought to eliminate those he deemed inferior, particularly Jews.
Right.
Stalin's ideology was rooted in Marxist-Leninist thought, but he twisted those principles to justify a totalitarian regime that sought absolute control over every aspect of Soviet life.
And in both cases, millions perish as a result of their ideologies and policies.
Yes.
It's a reminder that even ideologies that claim to promote equality and liberation can be perverted into tools of oppression and mass murder.
Absolutely. It's crucial to remember that no ideology, however well-intentioned, is immune to corruption or misuse.
Right.
When power is concentrated in the hands of a few and dissent is silenced, the potential for abuse is immense. And speaking of ideologies gone wrong, our next figure on the list is Mao Zedong, the leader of Communist China from 1949 until his death in 1976.
Right.
His policies, particularly the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, resulted in widespread famine, persecution, and social upheaval leading to the deaths of millions.
Mao, like Stalin, believed that radical social transformation was necessary to achieve his vision of a communist utopia.
Okay.
He launched the Great Leap Forward, an attempt to rapidly industrialize China, which resulted in disastrous agricultural policies that led to mass starvation.
Wow.
And then came the Cultural Revolution, a chaotic period marked by political purges, violence, and the destruction of traditional Chinese culture.
So we see a pattern here.
Yes.
Leaders driven by utopian visions who are willing to sacrifice countless lives in the pursuit of their ideological goals.
It's a cautionary tale about the dangers of fanaticism and the importance of balancing grand visions with a respect for human life and individual rights.
Absolutely. These cases underscore the need for critical thinking, even when confronted with seemingly noble ideals. It's essential to question assumptions, consider unintended consequences, and be wary of leaders who demand absolute obedience or demonize those who dissent.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about Pol Pot, the leader of the Khmer Rouge regime in Cambodia from 1975 to 1979.
Okay.
His brutal reign of terror, known as the Cambodian Genocide, resulted in the deaths of an estimated 2 million people, nearly a quarter of the country's population.
Yeah.
What was the driving force behind this genocide?
Pol Pot's ideology was a particularly extreme and distorted form of agrarian communism.
Okay.
He envisioned a Cambodia purified of modern influences, a society where everyone would work as peasants in the fields.
Wow.
To achieve this vision, he implemented a radical program of social engineering, emptying cities, abolishing money and private property, and forcing people into collective labor camps.
So it wasn't just about eliminating political opponents, it was about erasing any trace of modernity and imposing a radically egalitarian agrarian society.
Exactly.
But how did this vision translate into such horrific violence?
Well, Pol Pot's regime targeted anyone perceived as a threat to his utopian vision.
Okay.
Intellectuals, professionals, artists, religious leaders, even people who wore glasses or spoke foreign languages.
Wow.
They were seen as symbols of the old order and were systematically eliminated.
It's almost inconceivable that a regime could go to such a lengths to enforce such an extreme and unrealistic ideology.
It is.
It speaks to the power of fanaticism and the dangers of leaders who believe they have all the answers.
Pol Pot's regime is a stark reminder that utopian visions can easily turn into dystopian nightmares, especially when they are implemented through force and terror.
Right.
It's a lesson in the importance of skepticism towards grand promises of societal transformation, especially when those promises come at the expense of individual freedom and human dignity.
And now we come to Idi Amin, the dictator of Uganda from 1971 to 1979.
Right.
His reign was marked by brutality, ethnic persecution, and a bizarre cult of personality.
Yeah.
How did Amin's rise to power and his methods differ from the other figures we've discussed?
Well, Amin came to power through a military coup, seizing control of Uganda and quickly establishing himself as a ruthless dictator.
Okay.
Unlike the ideological zealots like Hitler, Stalin, or Mao Amin's rule, was more about personal power and enrichment than any grand vision of social transformation.
So less about ideology and more about pure unadulterated power.
Precisely. Amin was a master manipulator who cultivated a public image as a strong man and a defender of African interests.
Okay.
He used this image to consolidate his power, eliminating rivals, silencing dissent, and instilling fear in the population.
Right.
His regime was characterized by arbitrary arrests, torture, extrajudicial killings, and the expulsion of Asian Ugandans, all aimed at maintaining his grip on power.
So while other dictators on our list used ideology as a tool of control, Amin relied more on brute force and the cultivation of a personality cult.
Exactly.
It's a reminder that evil doesn't always have a sophisticated rationale. Sometimes it's just about raw power and the desire to dominate others.
And Amin's case also highlights the dangers of charismatic leadership unchecked by democratic institutions or a respect for human rights.
Right.
When individuals are given absolute power without accountability, the results can be devastating.
All right, before we move on to our final two figures, I think it's worth pausing to acknowledge the emotional weight of this discussion. We're talking about individuals whose actions resulted in the deaths of millions. And it's easy to feel overwhelmed by the sheer scale of human suffering we're confronting.
You're absolutely right. It's important to take a step back and acknowledge the emotional impact of this material. These stories are tragic, and they can be difficult to process. But I think it's also important to remember that even in the darkest corners of human history, there are always stories of courage, resilience, and hope.
Welcome back. As we wrap up our deep dive into these notorious figures, I'm struck by the sheer variety of individuals and motivations we've encountered. From conquerors to ideologues to despots driven by personal greed, the paths to mass atrocity seem disturbingly diverse.
Yeah, that's a key observation. It suggests that there's no single profile of a tyrant. No easy formula to predict who might become capable of such horrors. But by examining these figures in detail, perhaps we can glean some insights into the common threads that run through these dark chapters of human history.
Right, because if we can understand the factors that contribute to mass atrocities, maybe we can also start to think about how to prevent them in the future. So as we look back on the individuals we've discussed, what patterns or insights stand out to you?
Well, one recurring theme is the corrosive effect of unchecked power. Nearly every figure on our list operated in systems where accountability was weak or non-existent, whether it was Genghis Khan consolidating his power through fear and conquest, or Leopold II exploiting the Congo for personal gain. The absence of constraints on their actions allowed their worst impulses to flourish.
It's like the old saying, power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. But it's not just about individual power, is it? We've also seen how ideology can be a powerful driver of violence and oppression.
Absolutely. Ideologies, especially those that claim to offer simple solutions to complex problems, can be incredibly seductive. They provide a sense of certainty, a clear division between good and evil, and a justification for extreme measures. We saw this with Hitler's Nazi ideology, Stalin's twisted version of communism, and even Pol Pot's radical agrarian vision. These ideologies, while vastly different in their specifics, all shared a willingness to sacrifice individual lives in the pursuit of supposedly greater good.
And that brings us to another recurring theme, the dehumanization of the other. Many of these figures relied on propaganda and scapegoating to justify their actions. They painted their victims as enemies, as threats to the nation, or the revolution stripping them of their humanity and making it easier to rationalize their elimination.
Precisely. Whether it was the Jews in Nazi Germany, the kulaks in Stalin's Soviet Union, or the intellectuals targeted by Pol Pot, the process of dehumanization is a crucial step in paving the way for mass violence. By portraying their victims as less than human, as vermin or insects, these regimes were able to bypass the moral constraints that typically govern human behavior.
It's a chilling reminder of how easily prejudice and fear can be exploited to justify horrific acts. And it's something we still see happening today. Perhaps not on the same scale as these historical examples, but the underlying mechanisms are the same.
Yeah, that's why it's so important to be vigilant, to challenge hateful rhetoric, and to resist attempts to divide us based on ethnicity, religion, or any other arbitrary category. We must recognize that the seeds of mass atrocities are often sown in seemingly small acts of intolerance and discrimination.
So what can we do as individuals to help prevent such horrors from happening again? It can feel overwhelming, especially when confronted with the sheer scale of the atrocities we've discussed today.
You're right, it can feel daunting. But I believe that even small acts of courage and compassion can make a difference. Speak out against injustice whenever you see it. Support organizations that promote human rights and tolerance. Educate yourself about history and the warning signs of genocide. And perhaps most importantly, cultivate empathy and understanding in your own life. Strive to see the humanity in those who are different from you, and challenge those who promote hatred and division.
Those are powerful words, and I think they offer a hopeful message for our listener. We can't change the past, but we can learn from it and work to create a future where such atrocities are never repeated.
Exactly. Remembering the victims, understanding the root causes of these horrors, and committing ourselves to building a more just and compassionate world are the most powerful weapons we have in the fight against tyranny and genocide.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. It's been a heavy but necessary journey, and I hope you, our listener, will continue to reflect on these issues and engage in the ongoing conversation about how to prevent such atrocities from happening again.
Thank you for joining us on this exploration of the dark side of human history. May we all strive to be forces for good in the world, working to ensure that the lessons of the past are never forgotten and the mistakes of history are never repeated.